Welcome to CSIS Indonesia, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia book launch and discussion. Today, we're privileged and honored to have with us Mr. Murray Hiebert, a senior associate of the Southeast Asia program at the Center of Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Washington, D.C. with us. He will share with us his newly published book. Congratulations, Murray, for your book, Under Beijing Shadow, Southeast Asia, Asia Challenge. Aren't we feeling it here, especially? The book really very relevant with the current situation. We're feeling the heat of China rise and its involvement in Southeast Asia. China involvement, especially in South China Sea, that we experience have prompted a blend of anticipation and unease among its smaller neighbors. Luckily, Indonesia is not small, but we know there are smaller countries, a nation in Southeast Asia that feeling the heat certainly. However, who can debate China with its stunning growth of economic development and its rising military capability? It created tension in South China Sea, and also its effect in building dams in the Mekong River has actually made the people and the nation around China worried with to what extent Beijing ambition stands. Murray, you have been very experienced in working with Southeast Asia. In the beginning, when we chat, you mentioned that you've been here many times, and then you've been working with the region and in the region for many years. This is not your first book. Previously, you already published the book, Chasing the Tiger, and a book on Vietnam as well. And currently, this book, Under the Beijing Shadow, is your, accumulated knowledge of your understanding of the region and how the dynamic evolved. I am very glad to welcome you to CSIS webinar, and soon the screen will be yours. But firstly, let me have the honor to introduce you and your full bio. I hope you don't mind I read all of your achievement, but I promise I'll make it as short as possible. Murray Hiebert, the Senior Program Associate of the Southeast Asia Program at the CSIS Washington, D.C., has earlier served as Senior Advisor and Deputy Director to the CSIS Southeast Asia Program. But before that, he's also a Senior Director for the Southeast Asia Program at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Earlier, he was a journalist at the China Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. And before his posting to Beijing, he has worked for the Wall Street Journal of Asia and the Far Eastern Economic Review in DC, reporting on the dynamic of US and China relation. He was based in Hanoi as well, and I think that position of him has compelled him to write a book on Vietnam. And in his position at the Far Eastern Economic Review, he covered the development of the Indo-China nation, including Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. This book will be your turn, and I hope you don't mind sharing with us maybe the reason why we should be perhaps worried or maybe not worry of China rise. Murray, the screen is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Fitri. You almost summarized the book for me. You didn't leave me much to talk about. But no, thank you for those kind comments. So yeah, you've already cited the title of the book. It's a book in which I try to describe how Southeast Asia is responding to a risen China. I do it, except for the introductory chapter, I do it country by country. And I think it's fair to say that countries have an ambivalent feeling about China. On the one hand, there's expectation and hope, and the other, there's a little bit of fear and concern. One thing I should say, I started this book in late 2017 when President Trump was already the president and the criticisms of China were heating up in the US. I would say I tried very much to reflect the views of Southeast Asians and people living in Southeast Asian countries. I do, in the introductory chapter, talk a little bit about what some of the Trump administration policies and views are, but I try not to have those influence or color my perception of what China is doing in the region very much. I do describe in each chapter how China is engaging Southeast Asian countries with a diverse toolbox of soft power, soft power including economic cooperation, trade, education, hard power including military threats like you suggested in the South China Sea, some military sales, increased military exchanges. I spend quite a bit of time describing increased economic cooperation, and I can tell you that almost all countries are thrilled that China, since China opened up, how it has pulled them up by the bootstraps and has ultimately turned them in from middle or lower income countries into middle or upper income countries. But with its trade, buying so many products, selling products, and tourism has also become a big deal, including here in Indonesia, where I think the last figures I saw were in 2018, there were 2.1 million Chinese that had visited Indonesia that year. This year is going to be pretty small, and that's having a huge impact on the services sector of the economy. I talk quite a bit about the Belt and Road, which one of the things that I found is that it's a program that is having far more trouble getting off the ground in many countries than I had thought before I started doing closer research. In Laos, for example, tiny Laos with its 7 million people, they negotiated for 5 years, China and Laos, before they could come to an agreement on the trade deal, on the train deal. This included how much Laos would have to put in. It also included how much land China would get on each side of the railroad, included interest rates and those kinds of things. Here or there, I'm still in the US, but problems in Indonesia getting the Jakarta Bandung high-speed train off the ground. It had a lot of the project had a lot of problems getting land. In democracies, particularly, you find farmers don't want to give up their land. Well, that's true all over, but in some of the more democratic countries, it's been much harder for China to get land. Permits to do construction in the Philippines has been very tough, and I tried to figure out how much China has invested in the Belt and Road in Southeast Asia. It was hard. I finally went to a consulting company, RWR Associates in Washington, which does estimates on the on how much China has done, and they came up with $200 million between 2013 and 2018, which I have to say seems high to me, having visited these countries. Other challenges are corruption and kickbacks. In Malaysia, the East Coast Rail Link was a huge factor, one of the factors that resulted in the ouster in the 28 elections in Malaysia of Najib Razak. Former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad attacked him for corruption and overpaying, and said that when he was elected, he would stop the project. So he gets elected and he halted the project, but then negotiated with the Chinese, and ultimately cut the length of the train, and also cut the price by about a third. We see the same thing with a lot of corruption in special economic zones on the Lao-Chinese border, and also in Hanoi, Vietnam. The Sky Train is way cost overruns. There's a lot of shenanigans going on there. But one of the things that's interesting, besides the fact that China's having problems, is that China has demonstrated flexibility and willingness to compromise. And I cited the example of the Laos Railroad and the East Coast Rail Link in Malaysia. China is also very active in the digital Silk Road. Indonesia is a huge benefactor of that. It's Chinese companies like Alibaba, Tencent, JD, etc., are investing billions in Southeast Asia in the digital space. And Indonesia is the second largest benefactor after Singapore. And they go after, in Indonesia, targets. They invest in companies, unicorns like Gojek, Tokopedia, Traveloka, Traveloka, I can't pronounce it, sorry, it's not coming out right, and fintech companies. And then Huawei, which is a company that, a telecoms company that's getting a lot of grief in the West, in the United States. Trump has banned them from being involved in developing the 5G. The UK, Australia. But in Indonesia, there still seems to be cooperation with large Indonesian telecom giants. The telecoms minister at the last one that went out of office after when the new government was formed by President Jokowi, he said that Indonesia shouldn't be paranoid about using Chinese technology. I've also heard Indonesian officials say we've had various countries spying on us over the years, and China doesn't have a monopoly on that. I also cover the role of ethnic Chinese throughout the region. They've been coming to the region for hundreds of years. In Indonesia, you see the first evidence of showing up in Sumatra in 900 AD. In Malaysia, they played a major role in the colonial effort, in helping with the rubber plantations and palm oil. And then, in Indonesia, as Chinese workers come in to work on projects like some of the mining projects in Sulawesi, we've seen wild rumors in the media. I saw one headline, I think that in the Jakarta Post, which you don't usually think of as alarmist, that there were a million workers showing up at some projects in Sulawesi, which a million is a very big number, as you know. And there have been protests again this year after the COVID slowdown of the economy. Some ethnic Chinese came back to work in the mines and the export processing zones in Sulawesi, and there have been protests in the community. I cover the history of relations a little bit. The book, I should have said earlier, what I try to do is take a snapshot of where we were at in good journalism fashion, where we're at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2019. So I do some flashbacks to the past, but I mostly try to focus on really trying to describe what's happening today. I didn't quite succeed because the book had to go to the printer, before the publisher for editing, before the COVID really hit badly, and before Trump and China ratcheted up the trade war. But in some countries, many countries, especially that are on the border with China, have had a long history with China. Vietnam's history dates back a couple of millennia, and one at the first millennia AD, they were occupied for like 970 years. And after the communist victory in 1949 in China, Chinese forces supported communist forces against most of the countries in the region. And that does remain a legacy in many countries. And then in Indonesia, you have the additional factor of the allegations about China's involvement in the 1965 coup, which is still an issue in the relationship, and is an issue that comes up, at least indirectly, often in political conversations. There's an increase in military, as China's military grows, it steps up its mill-to-mill ties with countries. Arms sales have been growing, but they're still really, in most cases, far behind those of the United States. But after the coup in Thailand in 2014, the Thais bought 28 tanks and they ordered 3 submarines. You may have seen that earlier this week, Thailand, the protests are resuming against the former general who is now the prime minister, as well as raising some issues about the monarchy. And the legislature postponed the purchase of the 2nd and 3rd submarine from China this week. They said they were delaying it for a year, but sometimes when you delay something for a year, it does slip away further. Malaysia has also purchased 4 coastal patrol boats, 2 of which will be produced in China, 2 in Malaysia. Indonesia, maybe surprisingly, because it purchases from so many places, so many countries, has bought relatively little from China over the years. I talked quite a bit about soft power. One thing that you see a lot of is scholarships for students that maybe can't afford to go study in the West. Many of them are going to China, getting scholarships to go there. The figures I have for 1968, there are about in 2016, there were about 68,000, 23,000 Thais, 15,000 Indonesians, 11,000 Vietnamese, etc. Since 2010, there's the Confucius Institutes to teach Chinese have also picked up, especially in Indonesia since 2010. They started earlier in some other countries. There are about 30 in the region now, 15 in Thailand, 5 in Malaysia, and I think about half a dozen in Indonesia. And over the years, the last decade or so, China has really stepped up its invitation for visitors. So it's invited a lot of party officials. And in Malaysia, the ruling UMNO party, there was the ruling party till recently and may again become the ruling party. It has gone, so did the MCA, the Malaysia Chinese Association. But in Indonesia, both the PDIP and Democrat Party send officials every year to go and take some training on building the party. I don't think they take the classes on Marxist-Leninism, but they take other organizational classes. Academics are invited a lot, journalists a lot. One journalist told me in Indonesia that they get so many invitations at their newspaper that the journalists had stopped taking them. And then the invitations. And then religious leaders have also been going in recent years, particularly visiting Xinjiang to look at the Uyghur situation. The Uyghur situation is kind of interesting in Malaysia and Indonesia. There are, of course, from time to time, protests, relatively quiet protests in front of the Chinese embassy against its treatment of the Uyghurs. But the government has been relatively quiet, in contrast, sharp contrast to how it responded when Myanmar, a fellow ASEAN country, kicked a lot of the over 700,000 Uyghurs, Muslim Uyghurs, out of Myanmar. But in 2016, 5 leaders of NU visited Xinjiang. And when they came back, they described a very benign setting. People were allowed to pray 5 times a day. They had no trouble getting halal food. And shortly after they came back, the Chinese ambassador came to visit, and he gave them money to build an irrigation facility at one of their centers in West Java. I tried to look at if China is attempting political influence activities in Southeast Asia, and it was really pretty hard. It's much easier to see what they're doing in Australia or New Zealand, but in Malaysia, during the 2018, the ambassador was very active. The Chinese ambassador was very active in going to the ruling coalition sharamas, their rallies. So he would show up at Najib's rallies, at Zayed, the deputy prime minister, and at the MCA, the Malaysia Chinese Association rallies. And they put the MCA actually put up big giant posters of Xi Jinping meeting Najib, which you could only figure meant that if you re-elect the ruling coalition, that you're going to benefit like Malaysia benefited under Najib, which was through a lot of shenanigans on both parts, I guess. China ended up paying upfront way more money than was owed by how much it had done, so that gave this money in advance so that Najib could repay some of his debts under the 1MDB and have funds left to run his election. And then in 2016 and 2017, China really went after Singapore. It was prompted by Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong saying after the Hague Arbitral Tribunal ruling against on the Philippine case against China for taking Scarborough Shoal, he called Prime Minister Lee called for respect for rule of law, and that really Chinese thought he was really picking on them. There's also a fair amount of phishing and cyber phishing and cyber hacking. One of the countries that gets hit the hardest is Vietnam, ironically. So it's a neighbor, but it's also a communist comrade. And you'd think they might get some pass on some of this. But when Vietnam and China are about to sit down at a talks on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, China is known to fish in the Ministry of Commerce to try to get Vietnam's talking points. The same happened on APEC 2017 when both President Xi and President Trump were in Da Nang. And so they also hacked and tried to figure out what Vietnam was going to propose. Indonesia, during the election last year, Indonesian officials from the Election Commission talked an awful lot about Chinese and Russian hackers having attacked voters' lists in an attempt to disrupt elections. I didn't really hear very much about that after the election, so I'm not quite sure if more came out of that. I'm going to there are two areas that that already came up that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. They're both related to water. One is just emerging in the last 2 years or so, and the other is an older one that you all know about, that South China Sea. But the Mekong is really heating up. China has built 11 dams on its upper reaches of the Mekong. The Mekong starts in Tibet and then comes through China, Yunnan, and then through Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and then exits into the South China Sea through the Vietnamese Delta, the Southern Delta. The last 2 years, there's been a huge drought, and it's affected agriculture along the Mekong in Thailand and Laos. But in Cambodia, it has a double whammy of hitting the Tonle Sap Lake really hard. As you probably know, in the center of the country is this freshwater lake that shrinks down in the dry season, and the water all flows to the Mekong. And then when the water explodes in the Mekong, the water expands the Tonle Sap, and it grows several times larger than it is in the dry season. This this is more than just water that is flowing back and forth. There's also fish. So there's a lot of spawning of fish. And last year, China said, we're very sorry, that you're suffering this drought. We have a bad drought too. But about 3 or 4 months ago, a group called Eyes on the World took satellite photos of what was going on in China, and they found massive amounts of water being held back by the 11 dams. 2 dams alone, if you know American geography, 2 dams alone hold as much water as the Chesapeake Bay that's just outside of Washington, which is a huge bay. And it's nobody's surprised that they're having drought in lower Mekong countries. China came under a little pressure. At first, they denied it totally that was true, but at the meeting, the Mekong meeting in Phnom Penh last weekend, China agreed that they would share information about them holding back water. So we're going to have to see. But this the Mekong is likely going to have to become a South China Sea, a ASEAN issue also for ASEAN to deal with. And I'll conclude with a few comments about the South China Sea. Indonesia usually gets away with not being harassed quite as much as the Vietnamese, Filipinos, Malaysians, probably because it's way down here at the bottom of China's 9-dash line. But in in December last year and into January, Chinese Coast Guard vessels accompanied Chinese fishing boats again in the waters around Natuna Islands. Jakarta quickly sent warships and F-16 fighters to drive China away. But when Indonesia tried to arrest the Chinese fishermen, the Coast Guard vessels came back and blocked the Indonesian ships. This similar incident happened in 2016 and 2013, and you can go further back. Many of the incidences have not really been advertised very much, not reported to journalists. But this, Indonesia is only one of the places where China has become much more aggressive in asserting its rights over the South China Sea, the 80% within the 9-dash line. Both last year and this year, it was very active in harassing Vietnamese. Vietnam has a venture with Rosneft, the Russian company, and they were drilling for oil and gas, exploring for oil and gas, and the Chinese Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia vessels harassed them for 3 or 4 months last year. The same thing happened to Shell off the coast of Sabah and Sarawak, off Lakonia Reef, where Shell was looking for oil and gas and was also harassed for months on end. Vietnam complains a little more. Malaysia has been relatively silent, although in recent months it has been more outspoken again. It's hard to figure out what China is saying exactly. There are people, and they could be right, that say China is saying the natural resources in the South China Sea are ours. That means oil and gas and fish. Others say China really just wants to put a lot of pressure on countries to remember whose territory this is. It seems a little excessive to be quite that hyperactive if you're only trying to remind people that they're in your allegedly your territory. As you know, I should have mentioned the Tuna Islands are very rich in fish and hydrocarbons, and Western oil companies have been looking at doing oil and gas exploration there. I'll end there, but just say that the COVID happened after I finished the book and wasn't able to add any more to it, make any major revisions. But it had a pretty big impact when China cut off its borders for trade. It's now still got the tourism cut, which is having a big impact in Southeast Asia. And after the China got over its the COVID being so threatening inside China, its wolf warrior diplomats went abroad and picked fights with a lot of people. Australia and India are just two examples. And it was shocking to many people that that China would want to harass Malaysia and Vietnam, two of its neighbors, extensively while they were still trying to recover from COVID-19, which was a disease that really came from China, and ultimately China got a hold of it, got control of it. But so there's some concerns about in Vietnam, Malaysia, what this means. And then in the new Cold War, I don't think Cold War is quite the right term because China isn't the Soviet Union, but there's tensions have really ratcheted up, as you know, if you follow the newspapers, and Trump's put a lot of pressure on Huawei, and now he's putting pressure on TikTok to sell, but WeChat and even Alibaba are coming under a lot of pressure. And one of the things, there's a lot of questions whether this US pressure on China will lead to a bifurcation of the global economy, and that it's not clear that the US actually could separate from China totally because they're so dependent on each other. But one area where the US could really give China fits if it ultimately really chose to do so, and that's in technology. China produces only about 9% of its semiconductors. It needs these for the companies that I named, and it imports 40% of its semiconductors are imported from the United States, and so U.S. could easily give China some real fits in keeping some of these companies going if they can't get semiconductors. The other countries that are major producers of semiconductors are Taiwan and South Korea, both which are very close to the United States. So what happens if Biden's elected? There's a lot of frustration with China in the United States. It's become a bipartisan issue. American business, American politicians are irritated at China for IP, intellectual property theft, for forcing companies that invest to transfer technology, for their subsidies to state-owned enterprises, which means they can sell stuff for a lot less than companies from other countries. So I would suspect that Biden will he may not continue all the tariffs, but he will continue putting pressure on China. But he will be probably considerably softer. He's less sharp-elbowed than Trump. He won't be making policy at 3:22 in the morning when by Twitter. He will talk to the Chinese. He was the American point person to get to know Xi Jinping under President Obama when she was nominated for the top position in 2009. So they they spent a lot of time with each other in the US and in China. And I think you will expect him to look for areas to cooperate, like climate change, maybe Iran, maybe a few things like that. But trade is going to be tense for a while. I'll stop there and over to you, Evan.
Thank you so much, Murray. It's been enlightening. And I guess before we switch to Evan, I think there are very interesting point that more the reason for us to buy and read the book is is that as a rising power, of course, China is using its diverse toolbox and engaging in the region, as I can say, stick and carrot. Stick is the military, but first they would lure us with a carrot, with all of this economic cooperation, tourism, and soft diplomacy. And of course, for a smaller, medium size economic size country, that economic cooperation, the carrot is too good to be denied, you know. And but like to what extent that we can continue on having this enjoyment before the stick has, you know, hitting us. And I think you have been warning us really clearly about this. But I'm sure that Evan here. Evan is CSIS Indonesia senior lecturer. He graduated PhD from Syracuse University recently, and his focus is really on the regional security in the Indo-Pacific. Currently, looking at the military engagement in that region, as well as how Indonesia positioning itself. Currently, Evan is also I think drafting a book on Indonesian military, and I guess it's time to give the screen to Evan to give a comment, maybe rebuttal of what Murray has been geniusly wrote and conveyed to us. Evan, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Fitri, for that very kind introduction. And Murray, congratulations again on the book. I'd like to respond and discuss the book in a couple of ways. First, let me say that I think, unlike the standard narrative that's been coming out of DC about Southeast Asia, I think the book itself is very rich. It's a rich tapestry of the military aspects, the political aspects, the economics, the culture and history, and it's very nuanced. And I think that's in a twist of fate. I think nuance is sort of lost in DC right now, despite the fact that the US actually spent time in trying to understand the nuances in Southeast Asia. But the standard narrative goes something like this, that Southeast Asia is an important part of the world for US strategic interest. And so therefore the US has to compete against China in Southeast Asia. And the whole point is to woo or sway one Southeast Asian country away from Beijing and closer to Washington. The bipartisan consensus that Murray mentioned, for example, talks about how, Southeast Asian countries are weak, they cannot stand up against China, so we need to invest in military assistance programs so that they can stand up for themselves. And if the US were to be more muscular and flex its power, everybody will rally against China with the US. I think that's kind of the standard narrative that I think kind of robs the agency from Southeast Asia, both as a region and with their own domestic political interests. And I think what Murray has brilliantly captured in the book is the fact that it's not just about the US and China, that the interests of the political elites, that the history of ethnic Chinese in their own countries, that the economic challenges, they're a lot more complex, and each of the different governments and the political elites in Southeast Asia have their own calculations when engaging either China or the United States. And I think the details that Murray brings, whether it's about the high-speed rail, whether it's about the potential corruption issue, I think that highlights a key important point, that the different Southeast Asian countries have their own agency, and it's not prudent to always measure the behavior or the policies of Southeast Asian countries just based on a single yardstick, which is it in support or not of US or Beijing's agenda? And I think that's an important counter narrative. Secondly, I think when you take a bigger view of the details or the challenges that Southeast Asia face, both with China and the US, I think there's a couple of contradictions that we in the region haven't really quite figured out how to deal with. One, I think, given the domestic political constraints from each of the different countries, it is hard to see how geopolitical interests, which is to prevent a wider conflict in the region or to prevent great power politics from superseding everybody else's agenda, I think domestic political interests still plays a strong role. So what happens when domestic political interests are not in line with geopolitical interests? What happens when it is the elite's political interest to keep one foot out the door from a particular alliance, or to keep one foot in when it comes to a new economic alliance, which can ruin the broader geopolitical architecture. So this contradiction between domestic and geopolitical interests, I think, is something that we're not sure how it's going to turn out. The second part, and I think Marie mentioned this a little bit, is about the extent to which economic integration, whether within Southeast Asia or between Southeast Asian countries and China, to what extent does that lead to foreign policy realignments? The challenges of standing up to Beijing when your economic growth, your supply chain, both medical and trade, are all very much attached to China. In fact, most studies have shown that the ups and downs of Chinese economic growth led to the ups and downs of economic growth in Southeast Asia. And I think COVID has made that point even clearer, that it's not just economics and trade, but it's also medical supply chain. In Indonesia, about 80 to 90% of the companies involved with testing or medical supplies are affiliated one way or the other with Chinese companies. And the fact that we have problems with vaccine research and we had to sign a few of those deals with China, I think that tells us how vulnerable we are from the medical side. So I think what happens when we're trying to understand the downside of a closer economic and in fact a people-to-people integration with China, and whether or not COVID will lead us to think about ways to decouple as the US would like us to think about. I think India, Japan, and Australia have started to think about more seriously how to decouple from China, but I don't think that's a realistic option for most in Southeast Asia. So what happens when the forces of decoupling and integration comes to a head is something that we're not sure as well. The third contradiction, I think, is what happens to ASEAN as a regional organization. I think Murray has highlighted the key domestic challenges, the economic challenges, and even people-to-people ties. But the multilateral challenges of ASEAN is I think a key point that's worth exploring further, because multilateralism is not an independent force. It's only as strong as its leaders, and the leaders would be the key Southeast Asian countries. And unfortunately, traditional leaders like Indonesia have been largely missing from shaping the day-to-day management and effectiveness of ASEAN as a multilateral institutions. Right now, I think there are ideas about strengthening the East Asia Summit and how to improve our positioning on the Indo-Pacific. But as a multilateral institution, I think ASEAN itself has been largely missing from its role to mediate the US-China rivalry. And I think this is something that will have strong implications for how the domestic political elites also view the challenges of US and China. And I think lastly, when it comes to what's next, I think the future questions are important in a couple of ways. One, Murray mentioned about Trump versus a potential Biden administration. I'm worried that this thing with the US and China is not a problem of agency. And by that, I mean, it's not just a temporary fluke in the US-China relationship because Trump has been enormously unreliable and bordering on self-abdication of the US role. But what if this US-China trajectory is actually part of a larger structural issue of power transition in the region? It may not be a global power transition in terms of a Cold War type of setting, but at least in this part of the world, the path towards a more polarized region, I think, seems increasingly clear for us. That in every agenda that we talk about, the US has its own agenda, the China has its own agenda, and we're always forced to say something about those US or China agenda. So I think that that vortex, that pull factor from the US-China competition, I think is a lot stronger than just whether it's a Trump or Biden administration. And so if this is a structural problem of US-China transition in the region, What can we do to ensure that Southeast Asia can retain its strategic autonomy, whether as a region, whether as a multilateral institution through ASEAN, or the different individual countries? And I think this is something that it's probably not explored as in deep detail in the book, but I think from a policy standpoint, figuring out how to sort of fortify the national security and political systems of the different individual countries against great power politics is quite crucial. Both China and the US have a very big view of the world and of their competition. They have a long-term strategic outlook in mind, and yet in the region, we have a very short-term political outlook. And this is a big mismatch, and it's a huge problem because in issues like the South China Sea, for example, it is quite unfortunate that Indonesia, for example, remains fractured in its maritime governance structure between the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Fisheries Ministry, and all that. And not to mention the fact that Indonesia doesn't even have an executive national security council that can integrate the different instruments, whether it's diplomacy, defense, or even economics. So when something like the Natuna crisis happens, we're out of options. We rely on the same old playbook of let's show the flag, although it's completely mismatched between fishing vessels and F-16s. And it doesn't really prevent a future crisis from happening. And it doesn't also prevent what happens when we have an Achilles heel in our own political sphere, because not everybody in Indonesian government has the same understanding of UNCLOS. And if that happens, if China can take advantage or exploit those weaklings, and for some weird reason, for example, we agreed to some memorandum of cooperation that implicitly acknowledges China's claims in the Natunas, for example, then the whole thing unravels. And I think that's probably the same challenge in not all of Southeast Asian countries, but in most other Southeast Asian countries, the ability to take a wider strategic outlook, to have a coherent national security system to deal with the upcoming regional polarization, if not already ongoing, I think is an important policy task for all of us, whether those of us within the administration or outside. So I think from that standpoint, I think for us to be able to understand the big picture, we kind of need to understand the details of the little pictures as well. And I think Murray's book provides so much of that important details and insights, the history, the culture, the politics, the economics. And most importantly, I think it gives us a window of the different calculations and the different thinking of each of these political elites when they do certain things. So it's important, I believe, to promote this book, to read the book and to make it as a guide to our own policy understanding, because I think in times of uncertainty and complexity, having a simplified view that everything is about US and China and that Southeast Asia is nothing more than a trophy up for grabs, I think is a very dangerous play. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan, for very sharp and also in the rare occasion of being kind to China and then see how all the nation future is intertwined. But I think it's a wise and sobering outlook on how the Southeast Asian nation wanted to see that they're not dragged into U.S. and China and U.S. strategy competition and big power rivalry. And I think it would be, I guess, unfair and would be unwise to position it as such, because couldn't be actually living in this situation where when a country can just easily choose and not suffer the consequences. I think there's a lot of things to ponder upon what Evan saying and in response to Murray's book. And I also agree how it is important to see the trajectory into the future of the possibility of power transition. I don't know, Murray, as an American, will you accept this? And and whether is it really just a inherent structural problem of the power transition, that will pass after the transition has been established. And I don't know. I want to learn more of how you see it. But first, now we turn to the Q&A. We have already several questions, and the first is from Aldo Wismoyo Munandar. Aldo raised the question, the situation within the pandemic, and how countries in Southeast Asia respond to China growing development. And as you mentioned earlier, even and Evan as well, I think even in the pandemic, China is not being very kind and still flexing its military muscle, especially in South China Sea. And how do you think the Southeast Asian country should position itself, and especially Indonesia? I will put those comments first before we continue to the next. Please, Murray, the screen is yours.
Okay, thanks, Fitri, and thanks for the question. It's I want to also, in answering this, bounce off a little bit what Evan said toward the end of his comments. I think often Southeast Asia feels a little bit like poor me, poor us. We have these big nations mucking around us and threatening us. And it strikes me after doing research and talking to people in all these countries that Southeast Asia has a lot more agency often than it thinks it has. But so to achieve that, I mean, it just struck me as strange that Laos was able to negotiate a lower interest rate than Malaysia. And you realize, that's a very, in some ways, a simple problem, but you realize that Southeast Asians really don't talk to each other. They all have their own relations with China, their own relations with the United States, and they don't really coordinate very well. And when there's tensions in the South China Sea, obviously they, as one country in particular, often blocks a consensus. But if there was ways to convince the larger ASEAN family that if we work together, we will be able to have more pressure on China to have it treat us with more respect in areas like the South China Sea or the Mekong. And I think that if the countries came with a united voice, which is really tough. I know everybody's different history, different religion, different economy, different political system, different ethnicities. So it's tough, but it's not a unified entity. But if the countries could find a way to do that, China, it would feel somewhat probably shamed or embarrassed to stand up to 650 million Southeast Asians who are challenging it on some of this stuff, and they might be more willing to do for the region what they don't want to do for one country. So that's, and I think, this is where Indonesia sometimes is, and Evan alluded to this, sometimes Indonesia is a little bit missing in action. The ASEANs all wonder, where the heck is Indonesia? The biggest country, traditionally back in the day under Suharto and Ali Alatas, as foreign minister, Indonesia was a leader often, but more recent years it's been sort of holding back, and we see that President Jokowi is very focused on domestic development, but I think ASEAN could do more to protect itself if it recognized the agency that it actually had. I don't know if you think that's totally crazy, Evan, but.
Thank you, Murray. Excellent answer. I think, yeah, it's a challenge. And I agree. It's important to have a united voice. And that's also what we want. And I guess in this year, ASEAN Summit, at least finally, we have a chairman's statement that comment on the situation in the South China Sea because Vietnam is the chair of ASEAN this year by alphabetical order, by luck. So that's a big question, and it's really, I mean, what your question about where is Indonesia right now, where the motor is supposed to be, you know, mover and shaker in ASEAN, and I know, and then you know the reason as well, as you mentioned, that the current president focus is really on how the domestic situation and domestic politics is under control. Again, perhaps what's different between Indonesia with the US and China is like, as Evan said, China and US have big view, but short political like term, but like Indonesia has that short political view, and hopefully how do we build this, you know, big view that Indonesia have to regain its, you know, role again as, if I can, I mean, wish I could say that Indonesia can be a leader, a mover in ASEAN. Thank you, Mura. If I may, I will continue to the next question from Gilang Kembara. Gilang is our, you know, currently focus on maritime, but also work a lot on Mekong River issue. And he raised two questions. The first is about you focus on the issue of in Southeast Asian country. Do you also cover the sub-regional cooperation in ASEAN within ASEAN interests with China, such as the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, East Asia Growth Association, or the various regional growth triangle, and for example, also there's a cooperation in the Mekong River Delta, for example, and how that plays out in the region. You know, just in case if there's a post-ASEAN situation, is there any other, you know, what do you see in the future? And the second, the question on Beijing interest to become a blue water navy requires it to establish a number of logistic bases across different regions. To what extent has Beijing managed to influence ASEAN member states to allow its military infrastructure and asset to be established within the region? That's at all. Whether they would rent out their coast to host China, you know, power.
So,
power.
Thanks, Peach. Thanks for that question. Actually, I do not follow the sub-regional. I have followed in the past, but I haven't recently. The one down here, not in the Mekong. So I wouldn't want to comment on that. There has been the ACMEX, in the Mekong countries, which is Thai-led, which is to help provide, but it's the Irrawaddy. It names a bunch of rivers, and I forget exactly what it stands for, but it is to help help the region raise money on its own for development, so it doesn't have to rely totally on China or the international financial institutions. The problem is it's very small. And I think for it to really take off, it needs help. The Japanese and Americans have promised, but let's see what they ultimately do. And I think it also needs a lot of cooperation between Thailand and Vietnam, the two biggest powers on the mainland. They've in the past had some differences. I think they're much closer together now than they were. And I think this institution has some hope, but it's really still relatively small. They can do quite a bit in terms of training, but they really can't do much in terms of you know, building infrastructure, that kind of thing, roads, dams. Then in your second question, the Blue Water Navy, I mean, you know, of course, that I didn't mention this, but there is a lot of anxiety that Cambodia has agreed. The Wall Street Journal did a piece just over a year ago in which they talked about an agreement for China to use the Ream naval base, which is on the northwestern edge of where the sea in Cambodia and Thailand meet. And of course, that would have huge implications for Thailand because it's Sattahip Naval Base and its Utapao Air Base are just up the road from there, or just up. And it would give China a much easier access to the Spratly Islands than coming all the way from Hainan or from mainland China. So, you know, I don't know where this is going. I know ASEAN talks about this occasionally. I know some countries are talking to Cambodia about it. Hun Sen insists that he's never going to do it, but he does sometimes say there are, if China would support us on some peacekeeping missions, perhaps there would be a loophole for us to do this. And I think it would really change the dynamic. Thailand would have to move its bases to the exact opposite side of the Kra Isthmus. It would be a huge, you know, game changer on terms of countries building blue navies. I know everybody's talking a little bit about it. Indonesia's doing a little bit. Vietnam's maybe doing a little bit more. Thailand and Malaysia are trying, but it's compared to China, it's still very small peanuts, right? It's countries have a long way to go. And therefore it's useful to cooperate with countries like Japan, Australia, that could probably be somewhat helpful.
Okay, thank you, Murray. It's a good reading that countries in ASEAN have to actually strengthen its cooperation with Japan and Korea and seek its own independent, you know, economic source or investment source. It's very strategic, and thank you also for the reading of the Blue Water Navy, the ambition that Southeast Asian nation would want to build, and also, as you mentioned, the trend of acquisition of submarines and positioning its navy. We continue to the next question, and I think we have like a keyboard warrior that want to raise attention and give comparison, ask the comparison, maybe for you too. How do you see that the China approach to the ASEAN country, is it really more nuanced compared to the US? And because we know maybe they're more, maybe China is more consistent to its approach to the ASEAN nation compared to, you know, the US, and how do you see it in terms of, you know, in the future going forward? Maybe Murray, then Evan can give comment.
Okay. Well, one big difference is that China is close; it's in the neighborhood, and so but it does make a yeoman effort to show up at meetings. The U.S. under this administration, but even previous ones, does not always show up, and that's, you know, ASEAN, you know, doesn't really ask that much of the superpowers. So, you know, the least you can do is show up from time to time when they have meetings, their annual meetings. I suspect that would be maybe would be easier for if there's a change of administration. The Trump administration is rather thin on having people that are experienced in the various regions, and so it doesn't see there are not people in the White House that can convince Trump easily that it's important to go to the next ASEAN meeting. Whether that changes under Biden, I don't know. He was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a long time, so he does know a lot about foreign policy and has a lot of experience. You know, China is involved at so many levels. Like I talked about the toolbox. The United States is not here at so many levels right now. So much of the cultural stuff is gone. Of course, movies and music, they continue on their own from the free private sector, but the government does far less in terms of providing English language. Fulbright and Peace Corps have been cut back. which are both, I think, good soft power tools. And then in terms of economics, China has a much more complex view with both doing trade and doing the infrastructure stuff. Although, to be sure, the American private sector and the Japanese are still cumulatively far bigger investors than Japan in the region, cumulatively. And that might change over the years, but for now, China is still a relatively small investor in terms of companies investing in other companies. Maybe I'll stop there and let Evan continue.
Please, Evan. Thank you, Murray.
Sure, thank you. I think Murray talks about the policies. Let me talk about the communication part. I think we need to separate between the communications from the political elites versus the policy level people, those who are at the embassy, those who come from the ministries to the region and all that. So I think the nature of communication is important. And I think it's different between those that you see in terms of the tweets and all that versus those who come to the region and engage us. I think on the policy level, there's obviously a less bombastic way of communicating, but I do think there's a difference between the long game and the short game. At the moment, I think, of course, there is no easy way to compare the U.S. and China, and there's a longer debate to be had about that. But I think from a communications standpoint, I think they're both horrible right now. I think China likes to think of us as simply an agent to be influenced by the U.S., that we like to stand up for our own interests means that we must be doing it for some other reason. The U.S. also thinks that because they stand for the rules-based order, we should be supporting them, and not to mention the lecture about human rights and democracy. So I think from a communication standpoint, I think they both, to put it very plainly, and excuse me for being candid, I think they all think we're all stupid. In the way they talk to us, that we don't understand what's happening with the outside world. So from a communication standpoint, the short-term style, I think, is problematic on both sides. The long game, however, when it comes to, as Murray mentioned earlier, about people-to-people engagement, education scholarships, a military education and training, I think from this yardstick, I think China has a little bit advantage in terms of the public relations stuff. So, for example, the Chinese embassy in Jakarta, for example, have been making inroads into various political events, into the birthdays of mass organizations and all that. Something that the U.S. used to do, but not anymore. But those, I think, are not sustainable, because I think the way that the U.S. has invested in its relationship with us, whether it's from people to people, whether it's education exchanges, both military and civilian, I think from a capital standpoint, the U.S. has longer capital with the political and the policy elite in Indonesia, at least. In some places, I think in Southeast Asia, things might be a bit different. Some countries in Southeast Asia send more of their officers and their future political leaders to China, but the majority still sends them to Western countries, whether it's the US, Australia, the UK, and others. And for sure, when it comes to military education, the US and Australia, for Indonesia at least, are the top two provider of education and training by a mile. And China will never be able to change that balance overnight. So from a long game point of view, I think the U.S. still has the baseline capital. It hasn't been utilized very well because of the short-term communication style in the past few years. Can China overturn that long game overnight. I don't think so, and certainly not by investing in high profile events alone, and not the longer term stuff. And I think because of the role of ethnic Chinese in, across Southeast Asia that Murray mentioned, it is also not easy, politically speaking, for the elites to try to change the human capital investment from the Western countries to China as well. So I think for now, the nuance, at least on the high profile stuff, China maybe has a few points ahead. But in the long run, I think the US still has the necessary goodwill and capital. But across the board, I think communication style, they're both horrible at this point.
Thank you, Irfan. That's very witty and very candid of you. I couldn't agree more. And I think both countries can do better in I mean, promoting the agency of Southeast Asian country as, you know, country that have the ability to think and act, and would be, you know, would increase the cooperation even more in the region, you know. For the next question, it's from CSIS Indonesia, head of International Relation Department. She wants to mention that CSIS Indonesia recently did an expert survey on global and regional dynamics. This survey, disclaimer, is not yet released, but will be soon. And one of the findings is stated that mentioning that COVID is accelerating structural changes in the global order, including the increasing the severity of strategic rivalry between the US and China. However, only 44%, I mean, almost half of the respondent answer that this changes is permanent. It can be permanent. So what do you think in seeing this optimism about the future of the global order, that the severity of the US and China rivalry would bring change to global order? And Murray, what do you think of this? And as somebody that wrote extensively, how do you see it projected in the region? Screen is yours.
Yeah, that's yeah, it's a big question. It's really important. And I tried to address that a little bit. And I'm not sure that the COVID was a major factor in the US ramping up its pressure on China. I think Trump's concern that he might lose the election and that China was a good foreign enemy to attack was easily as important as the COVID itself. And I said that before, and I think that the rivalry on economics is really going to, we had a lot of rivalry in the military space, particularly in the South China Sea. But I think it's going to become much more sharp also now economically, as the US is encouraging companies to move out. I don't think all of them can, because we're so inextricably linked. That's what makes it so different from, let's say, the old Soviet Union. But some companies will move. They were planning to anyway. But the technology thing, I think, is a tough question. And I think Southeast Asians are going to have to they could be impacted by this quite a bit. They are part of the supply chain. They produce things that go into the various widgets that China produces and sells to Europe and the United States and around the region. And that is going to become much harder. And what does the US do if Indonesia is supplying parts for Huawei, for example? Is the US going to I happen not to know the answer at all. Is the US going to punish countries, punish companies that are cooperating with China on some of these technology issues? And this would face Vietnam, face Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. also. So I think that's the bigger concern. I just think it's crazy if the U.S. or China try to focus to get Southeast Asians to choose one side or the other. That's just not going to work. Southeast Asians, as Evan said, they're not all stupid, and you know, they understand their situation, and they have to try to figure out their steps forward. And I think that they were going to have to try to navigate this complexity and keep dealing with both.
Thank you, Murray. It's really a very wise, very measured answer. And I'm quite curious, and I think my concern is like resonate with other like maybe participant in this discussion. There's one question that asked about like as you know that the U.S. is not as earlier, U.S. is not really good in communicating, and then you're saying the situation of this increasing tension between U.S. and China is not only COVID but also because of the Trump. Like, is there any ways that the U.S. can do to actually communicate better? Perhaps Evan as well. Like, what do you mean, like not seeing if a country is stupid, for example, and whether this kind of I mean, if U.S. able to actually improve its communication and whether to an extent whether the relationship in the region will be better, or whether they actually the unified voice in ASEAN will. What does it mean to the region? Whether they have to choose one side or what? Maybe not. Okay. Maybe Murray and maybe Evan could give comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I don't think they're ultimately that. I just don't see how the U.S. or China can insist on that choosing sides. We have. As Evan and I have both said, the relationships that the United States has with a country that China has with a country, let's say like Indonesia, are so multifaceted. You can't say that you have to choose because we're enemies with China in one sector. And so I think the countries should reject that notion. And you know, I think one thing that you know, you're asking how the U.S. could communicate better. I think sometimes you have officials who understand the importance of Southeast Asia and articulate it very well. I don't think that's happened recently, but Southeast Asia, you know, as with its 650 million people, a GDP of 2.5 trillion, is what as a grouping, it's I think the 4th or 5th largest economy on the planet. And I think that's significant. And so you have to use, I think, the clout and the power that gives you to get countries, get the large powers to recognize the region and not view the region as a pawn in fighting against China or fighting against the United States.
Thanks, Mary. Evan, any comment on that? How would they communicate better? Probably US in its election time.
Yes, I think election year always makes everybody go a little off the side. So that's natural. It's not just a US thing, it's everybody's thing. But again, this comes back to whether or not we accept the assumption that the tension in US-China relations, is it a product of individuals like Trump, or is it a longer structural competition between two of the world's greatest superpower right now? And if we accept the first argument that this is simply an idiosyncratic moment for the US-China relations, then all we have to do is just wait for a new president, in the US at least, because China is obviously not the same mechanism. And one can make that argument clearly because under Obama, for example, I think the communication from the U.S. side to Southeast Asia was a lot better. The way that the policy makers, when they come to the region, they don't come to the region by saying, what can we do for you to get you to stand up to China, but what can we do for you because you're important to us. So sure, the different nature of communication can be a function of the different administration. But if we take the longer view and that this is a structural feature, then I'm afraid at one point or the other, whether it's a new administration this year or 4 years from now or 8 years from now, if the problem of the transition between US and China is not managed carefully, and I think we will still have the same problem, because at some point, Southeast Asia will be viewed through that lens. To what extent is the region swaying one way or the other? And as Marie said, it's not really an option. In the past, I think, because COVID didn't invent U.S.-China tension, right? COVID merely accelerates a pre-existing trend, which means that we've seen this problem between U.S. and China for a while now. It's been going on for about 10, 20 years. It's not something that just happened overnight. And if that's the case, can the old playbook work? So far, a lot of countries in the region likes to promote this simplistic view of, well, we cannot choose one over the other because we want both, right? We want both US and China to be equally engaged with the region. China perhaps from an economic standpoint, the US perhaps from a security standpoint. So the US provides the security guarantees and peace, and China provides the prosperity part. And I think what's changing right now is that may no longer be the option, because the US doesn't accept just being the guy to provide security but not partaking on the other stuff. And so does China. China hates the idea that the security in its own backyard has to be provided by none other than the US. So I think it's the structural incompatibilities and interests between US and China that makes the old playbook that Southeast Asia has always had to engage both US and China to be not working anymore. And what's the solution? I don't think we have come up with a good solution. I think, to be honest with you right now, given Indonesia's absence of leadership in ASEAN, I think a lot of countries in Southeast Asia is now just out for themselves. I think they're exploring options in their own way. Vietnam is certainly exploring options in its own way. Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines to some extent. So I think now it's every country in Southeast Asia for themselves. There's no more collective voice. There's no more ASEAN voice. It's just every country for themselves. And if that's the case, then it really is not up to us to determine how the region can shift one way or the other, but it's up to the individual countries to take some calculated management of risks and benefits from engaging both.
Thank you, Evan. I guess what you're saying is right, and also I think Murray also mentioned how other countries in Southeast Asia are already initiating, raising fund from themselves. For example, Thailand that Murray mentioned. I guess it's 8 minutes before the time is closed. We still have several questions. There's one from YouTube from Joseph that asking about, because Murray, responding to Murray comment on bringing Japan and Korea, what do you think if we also bring the wider region, for example, Australia and India to the balance, to balance out China? And how do you see this mix? Is there anything need or can be for formalized? And what do you see the opportunities there? Murray, the screen is yours.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Southeast Asia has worked at building relations with Japan. Japan is really an old timer in the region. And a big investor, and trying to be a positive force in the region. Korea is really stepping up recently. So Australia Korea is becoming a much bigger investor in recent years. Australia India, some people talk about India, but you often hear complaints from Southeast Asians that India, it has it's a big power and it should be significant, but it's very slow, and to get into the cooperation on trade, for example, in the RCEP, and had to step out so that the RCEP could move ahead. And it's a fear that, India is still not acting east, let alone talking east. And so but I think that engaging the countries you mentioned, and I think you could put the European Union in there in some ways, is a hedge. It gives countries like Australia and Japan are very big in the Mekong, for example, playing a major role, and the US is a bit of a late comer. And there are projects that Japanese and Australians have started. Japan is doing a project on power lines, for example, to connect power sources to the urban areas and within the Mekong, and Australia is helping on some legal issues of trafficking and people trafficking in wildlife, that kind of thing. And the US has joined those, so they can actually be trendsetters and play a significant role in capacity building and finding ways to help the countries in the region hedge a little bit against China, and if need be against the US. So that's a really important point.
Thank you, Murray. I think because of the time, this is going to be the last question from John Macbeth. He's he's a writer and he published several articles, and he wants to look from the position of Indonesia and seeing how the Beijing claims of the 9 dotted line that impacted or intrudes the Indonesia exclusive economic zone. And I think you probably discussed this in your chapter on Indonesia. And it has frustrated several diplomats in Indonesia. One of them, Bapak Hasim Jalal, that known as the father of the maritime diplomacy in Indonesia, and but it never been actually addressed directly, and she was always skirted, and as an Asian way, don't face the problem directly. It's by waiting for the time. But how do you see this issue raising up? Would you think that it will be the new flashpoint, or what do you see? Maybe Murray and then Evan, and then if you can put a closing remark on your answer before I close. Please, Murray.
Well, thanks, John. John Macbeth and I are old colleagues, and so it's good to hear from him. Well, as John's alluding to, the 9-dash line comes down to just north of, well, the EEZ around Natuna Islands actually reaches into the 9-dash line, which is a problem. And China, when it's been involved in the incidents that have been very public in 2013 and the one in 2016, and then again the one early this year, it constantly talks about a traditional fishing area. So although a traditional fishing area is not a term that UNCLOS recognizes, but I think that as China becomes more ambitious in pressing its claims, I think Indonesia often felt that it wasn't a claimant, and therefore it was going to, get off easier than its neighbors. As China presses its claims for natural resources, they do include seafood, and plus there's oil and gas there around Natuna, which ExxonMobil was working on for quite a while, very interested in it. I think it's quite possible that the tensions between Indonesia and China in that area are going to heat up. And I think Indonesia maybe has to join the other partners that like Malaysia and Vietnam and Philippines in finding ways to address this with China. I think Indonesia staying outside may get caught if it doesn't find ways to work with its neighbors to collectively pressure China on this. Yeah.
Thank you, Murray. Efan, do you have any comment?
Sure. I think, first of all, China's claims has not been made clearer in the last few years. I think they've come up with new terms to justify their behavior. Of course, it has to be separated between Chinese behavior in the disputed parts of the South China Sea and with Indonesia. I think with Indonesia, I think the claim hasn't been made clearer. They still haven't told us exactly the basis of their claims and where those particular coordinates are. And I think they've been trying to come up with new terms: historic fishing rights, jurisdiction over relevant waters, but none of them are based on UNCLOS, and certainly not based on what we know as the tribunal ruling in 2016. So as long as that particular claim has never been made clarified, I don't see any reason why Indonesia should even entertain the idea of a bilateral conversation over maritime rights between us and China. We do have disputed overlapping maritime domain with Vietnam and Malaysia in the North Natuna Sea, and that's an ongoing conversation and negotiation, but we don't have anything with China. So I think from that standpoint, it hasn't been made clearer. What has been made clear is the intention of China to push the issue further, and that Indonesia's ability to withstand the poking and prodding from China is essential for the wider claim in the South China Sea, for China's wider claim. What does it do for the diplomatic relations? I think it depends on who's the president. Under Jokowi, Jokowi doesn't want to make this a center part of its relationship with China. So all these crises and incidents for him is just a noise that he wants to make go away. He's not interested in figuring out ways to prevent the crisis from happening again. He just wants it to go away, which is why when he came to the Natunas, he thought he would make things go away. But of course, these things will happen again. So I think that sidelining of the Natuna and China from a security and a strategic standpoint is why we're in this mess between us and China in the first place. In an ideal world, I think Indonesia should have a much more developed strategy beyond just diplomatic protest and sending warships. I think, yes, precisely because we're not a claimant in the Spratleys, I think we have a very good relationship with China. We've built that capital over the years, and the president himself, I think, has a good personal rapport with Xi Jinping. My question is, why hasn't that been used to change China's behavior in the Natunas? I'm not even talking about getting China to renounce the Nine Dash Line or to stop them from coming up with weird terms to justify their claims. But my sense, if we have one realistic goal, it should be to stop Chinese fishing vessels operating in our EEZ. That's it. And I don't understand why we haven't been able to use the capital that we have with Beijing to get them to modify their behavior on this front. So what does it do for relationship? Not much. Economic trade and investment continues. This is on the sidelines. We will have to see what happens under a new Indonesian president in about a few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Efan. If I may, took the liberty to raise the last question to Murray to close. Under Beijing shadow, Southeast Asia, China challenge, do you think there would be a time that to see how this overcast would turn into an opportunity instead of the challenge? Please.
Well, I think it's always going to be a challenge. You know, I grew up in, part of the reason that I'm very interested in this kind of relationship is I grew up in Canada. And, you know, if you live next, one of our prime ministers used to say, you know, if you sleep in the same bed with an elephant, the elephant shakes a little toe and the whole bed shakes. And that's really, you know, and Canada and the United States, they get along fairly well, but Canadians often feel they're bullied. And I really think that Southeast Asia has its job cut out for it by living next to this very big neighbor who is trying to flex his muscles and figure out where he fits in the world. And so I think the sun, it's going to be a while till the shadows disappear and all you have is bright sunlight and happiness for everybody. So
Thank you,
good luck
Murray.
to you and getting to that place.
Thank you, Murray. It's brilliant. Under Beijing shadow, Southeast Asia China's challenge can be found in online bookstores of your preference. And I think for the physical hard copy book, shipping will take sometimes in this COVID situation for you to find in physical bookstore if you can still visit them. Thank you, Murray. It's such an honor to have you with us. It's really timely and relevant book. And for those of you viewers of this YouTube recording later on, I think there's a benefit to see the elephant that we're currently sleeping with. Thank you, Murray.
Fitri, thank you very much. Thank you, Evan. Good to see you, Evan.
Good seeing you, Murray. Thanks for coming.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.